As You Like It is a pastoral comedy by William Shakespeare, believed to have been written in 1599 and first published in the first folio in 1623. The play's first performance is uncertain, though a performance at Wilton House in 1603 has been suggested as a possibility. Historically, critical response has varied, with some critics finding the play a work of great merit and some finding it to be of lesser quality than other Shakespearean works. The play has been adapted for radio, film, and musical theatre. Shakespeare begins his play with a pair of dueling brothers, an amendment of his source material, Thomas Lodge's popular prose romance, Rosalind, that allows him to establish, with great economy, the corrupt nature of so-called civilized life. Oliver's mistreatment of his brother spurs Orlando to journey into the curative forest of Arden, as surely as Frederick's actions did his own brother's, Duke Senior, which immediately locates a play in the pastoral tradition. Those wounded by life at court seek the restorative powers of the country. But fraternal hostilities are also deeply biblical and resonate with the story of Cain's murder of Abel, an act that confirmed mankind's delivery from paradise into a world of malignity and harm. The injustice of Oliver's refusal to educate and otherwise share his fortune with Orlando seems all the more outrageous because it is perfectly legal. The practice of primogeniture stipulated that the eldest son inherits the whole of his father's estate, so that estates would not fragment into smaller parcels. Primogeniture was not mandated by law in Shakespeare's England, but it was a firmly entrenched part of traditional English custom. With such a system governing society, inequality, greed, and animosity became unfortunate inevitabilities, and many younger sons in Shakespeare's time would have shared Orlando's resentment. Orlando, the youngest son of the recently deceased Sir Rowland de Boys, describes his unfortunate state of affairs to Adam, Sir Rowland's loyal former servant. Upon his father's death, Orlando was bequeathed a mere 1,000 crowns, a paltry sum for a young man of his social background. His only hope for advancement is his brother, Oliver, honors their father's wish and provides him with a decent education. Oliver, as the eldest son, inherited virtually everything in his father's estate, yet he not only neglects his charge but actively disobeys it. Although he arranges for his other brother, Jakes, to attend school, Oliver refuses to allow Orlando any education whatsoever, leaving the young man to lament that his upbringing is little different from the treatment of a piece of livestock. Orlando has long borne this ill treatment, but he admits to Adam that he feels rising within himself a great resentment against his servile condition and vows that he will no longer endure it. Oliver enters, and the hostility between the brothers soon boils over into violence. Orlando claims that the system that allows the eldest son to inherit the bulk of a father's estate does not reduce the ancestral blood in other sons. Oliver, offended by his brother's insolence, assails Orlando, while Orlando seizes Oliver by the throat. Adam tries to intervene, seeking peace in the name of their father, but the brothers do not heed him. Orlando, undoubtedly the stronger of the two, refuses to unhand his brother until Oliver promises to treat him like a gentleman or else give him his due portion of his father's estate so that he may pursue a gentlemanly lifestyle on his own. Oliver hastily agrees to give Orlando part of his small inheritance and in a rage dismisses Orlando and Adam, whom he chastises as an old dog. Shakespeare begins his play with a pair of dueling brothers, an amendment of his source material, Thomas Lodge's popular prose romance, Rosalind, that allows him to establish with great economy the corrupt nature of so-called civilized life. Oliver's mistreatment of his brother spurs Orlando to journey into the curative forest of Arden, as surely as Frederick's action did his own brother Duke Senior, which immediately locates the play in a pastoral tradition. Those wounded by life at court seek the restorative powers of the country. But fraternal hostilities are also deeply biblical and resonate with the story of Cain's murder of Abel, an act that confirmed mankind's delivery from paradise into a world of malignity and harm. The injustice of Oliver's refusal to educate or otherwise share his fortune with Orlando seems all the more outrageous because it is perfectly legal. The practice of primogeniture stipulated that the eldest son inherits the whole of his father's estate, so that estates would not fragment into smaller parcels. Primogeniture was also mandated by law in Shakespeare's England, but it was a firmly entrenched part of English tradition and custom. With such a system governing society, inequality, greed, and animosity became unfortunate inevitabilities, and many younger sons in Shakespeare's time would have shared Orlando's resentment. In this opening scene, Shakespeare begins to muse on another theme common in pastoral literature, the origin of gentleness. As scholar Jean E. Howard makes clear in her introduction to the play, gentleness refers to both nobility and a virtuous nature. Elizabethans were supremely interested in whether this quality could be achieved or whether one had to be born with it. And Orlando shows himself to be a man of the times. Though Oliver has denied him all forms of education and noble living, Orlando nonetheless has a desire for gentleness. As he assails Oliver, he claims that his gentlemanlike qualities have been obscured, but feels confident that he could develop them still. Of course, Oliver's behavior suggests that gentleness has little to do with being born into nobility. Though he has the vast majority of his father's estate at his fingertips, he proves lacking in the generosity and grace that would make him a true gentleman. The audience then looks optimistically to Orlando, who vows to go find his own fortune on his own. Oliver bids his servant Dennis to summon Charles, the court wrestler, who has been waiting to speak to him. Oliver asks Charles for the news at court, and Charles reports that Duke Senior has been usurped by his younger brother, Duke Frederick, and has fled with a number of loyal lords to the forest of Arden. Because the noblemen have forfeited their land and wealth by going into voluntary exile, Duke Frederick allows them to wander unmolested. When Oliver asks if Senior's daughter Rosalind has been banished, Charles says that the girl remains at court. Not only does Duke Frederick love Rosalind as though she is his own daughter, but the Duke's daughter Celia has a great friendship with her cousin and cannot bear to be parted from her. Charles asserts that two ladies never loved as Celia and Rosalind do. Charles then admits his real reason for coming to see Oliver. He has heard rumors that Orlando plans to disguise himself in order to enter a wrestling match at the royal court. Because Charles' reputation depends upon the brutal defeat of all his opponents, he worries that he will harm Orlando. He begs Oliver to intervene on his brother's behalf, but Oliver replies that Orlando is a conniving and deceitful scoundrel. He convinces Charles that Orlando will use poison or some other trick in order to bring down the wrestler. Charles threatens to repay Orlando in kind, and Oliver, pleased with Charles's promise, plots a way to deliver his brother to the wrestling ring. The episode with the wrestler Charles is important for several reasons. First, it provides further evidence of the prejudices that rule court society. Charles visits Oliver because he worries about defeating Orlando. Although Charles is paid to be a brute, he fears that pommeling a nobleman, even one so bereft of fortune as Orlando, may win him disfavor in the court. Such deference on Charles's part speaks of the severe hierarchy of power that structure court life. Charles also provides necessary plot explication. Through Charles's report to Oliver, Shakespeare sketches the backdrop of his comedy, that is, the usurpation of Duke Senior by Duke Frederick, Rosalind's precarious situation, and the quality of life in the forest of Arden. Although set in France, the forest to which Duke Senior and his loyal lords flee is intentionally reminiscent of Sherwood Forest, the home of Robin Hood. It is, in Charles's estimation, a remnant of the Golden World, a time of ease and abundance from which the modern world has fallen. Thus, before we even ever see Arden, which cannot be located on any map, we understand it as a place where Orlando will find the remedy he so desperately seeks. Rosalind is depressed over the banishment of her father, Duke Senior. Her cousin Celia attempts to cheer her up. Celia promises that as the sole heir of the usurping Duke Frederick, she will give the throne to Rosalind upon his death. In gratitude, Rosalind promises to be less melancholy, and the two women wittily discuss the roles of fortune and nature in determining the circumstances of one's life. They are interrupted by the court jester Touchstone, who mockingly tells of a knight without honor who still swore by it. Libo, a dapper young courtier, also arrives and intrigues them with the promise of a wrestling match featuring the phenomenal strength and skill of the wrestler Charles. The match's participants enter with many members of the court, including Duke Frederick, who cordially greets Rosalind and Celia. The Duke remarks on the danger Charles's young challenger faces, and he suggests that the girls attempt to dissuade the present challenger from his effort to defeat the wrestler. Rosalind and Celia agree and call to the young man, who turns out to be Orlando. Try as they might, they cannot sway him. He remains deaf to their pleas and speaks as if he has absolutely nothing to lose. Orlando and Charles wrestle, and Orlando quickly defeats his opponent. Amazed, Duke Frederick asks Orlando to reveal his identity. When Orlando responds that he is the youngest son of Sir Rowland de Bois, the Duke laments that he wishes Orlando had been someone else's son. Admitting that he and Sir Rowland were enemies, Rosalind and Celia rush in to offer their congratulations, and Rosalind admits how deeply her father admired Orlando's father. In the exchange, Orlando and Rosalind become mutually smitten, though both are too tongue-tied to confess their feelings. Immediately after Rosalind and Celia take their leave, Libo warns Orlando that though his victory and conduct deserve great praise, he will get none from Duke Frederick. In fact, Libo says the Duke is due for a dangerous outburst. Orlando, already heartsick over Rosalind, resolves to flee from the tyrannical Duke. As many critics have pointed out, Rosalind's relationship with Celia suggests an element of homoeroticism. Homoeroticism differs from homosexuality in connoting feelings of desire or longing between members of the same sex, but not necessarily the desire for actual sex acts. Celia begins Act 1, Scene 2 by challenging the depth of her cousin's love for her, claiming that the depressed Rosalind would be content if she only returned Celia's love. Celia's language here conforms to conventional protestations of romantic love, and there is no doubt that the women's friendship is remarkable. When Celia pleads with Duke Frederick to allow Rosalind to stay at court, she points out that the pair has always slept in the same bed. People normally slept to a bed in Shakespeare's time and went everywhere together, coupled and inseparable. The women's special bond is not lost on those who witness their friendship, as Duke Frederick's courtier, Libo, claims the cousins share a love that is dearer than the natural bonds of a sister. Before jumping to conclusions about the nature of Rosalind and Celia's relationship, it is important to note that contemporary ideas about sexuality are quite different from Elizabethan ideas, whereas people today tend to Rosalind is overcome with the emotions for Orlando. Celia asks her cousin how she could possibly manage to fall in love with Orlando so quickly. Just then, Duke Frederick approaches and demands that Rosalind leave the royal court. He denounces her as a traitor and threatens her with death should she be found within 20 miles of court. Rosalind does not know how she has offended the Duke and pleads her innocence, but the Duke remains firm. When Rosalind asks him to explain his decision to banish her, Duke Frederick replies that she is a father's daughter and that is enough. Celia makes an impassioned plea on Rosalind's behalf, but the Duke condemns Rosalind for her smoothness and silence and tries to convince his daughter that she will seem more beautiful and virtuous after Rosalind is gone. Celia announces that in banishing Rosalind, Duke Frederick has also banished Celia, and the two women decide to seek out Duke Senior in the forest of Arden. Realizing that such a journey would be incredibly dangerous for two wealthy, attractive young women, they decide to travel in disguise. Celia has a common shepherdess and Rosalind as a young man. Celia renames herself Eleanor, while Rosalind dubs her disguised self as Ganymede, after the cupbearer of Jove. The two decide to convince Touchstone, a clown, to accompany them on their journey. Tend to expect adherence to neatly defined and mutually exclusive categories of behavior, such as heterosexuality or homosexuality. At the same
Sexual
time,
identity
Elizabethans
was
could be
more
very
loosely defined in
inflexible in
Shakespearean
their
England
notions of the
than
sexual
in
and
literature
social
and
roles that
culture,
different
if
genders
not in
play.
actual
They
practice.
place greater importance
Elizabethans
that we
were
do
tolerant
on the
of
external
same-sex
markers of
couplings,
gender,
indeed.
such as clothing and
Homosexuality
behavior.
was an
So to
inescapable
Elizabethans,
part of the Greek and Roman
Rosalind's
classics
decision to
that
masquerade
made up
as a
an
man may
educated
have been
person's
more
culture in
thrilling
Shakespearean
than
day.
her homoerotic bond with Celia and perhaps even threatening to the social order. By assuming the clothes and likeness of a man, Rosalind treats herself to powers that are normally beyond her reach as a woman. For instance, instead of waiting to be wooed, she adopts the freedom to court a lover of her choosing. By subverting something as simple as a dress code, Rosalind ends up transgressing the Elizabethans' carefully monitored boundaries of gender and social power. Indeed, it is this very freedom that Rosalind seeks as she departs for the forest of Arden. Now go we in content to liberty and not to banishment. By christening herself Ganymede, Rosalind underscores the liberation that awaits her in the woods. Ganymede is the name of Jove's beautiful young male page and lover, and the name is borrowed in other works of literature and applied to beautiful young homosexuals. But while the name links Rosalind to a long tradition of homosexuals in literature, it does not necessarily confine her to an exclusively homosexual identity. To view Rosalind as a lesbian who settles for a socially sanctifying marriage with Orlando, or to view Celia as a jilted lover, is to relegate both of them to the unpleasantly restrictive quarters of contemporary sexual politics. The Forest of Arden is big enough to embrace both homosexual and heterosexual desires. It allows for both, for all, rather than either or.